I stood on the driveway at the spot that he was murdered, and I started crying. It's very overpowering. I mean, it takes you over, and just the thought of a man being, killed in front of his family like that, and having a couple of sons myself, the thought of being taken away from my sons like that, it's just so profoundly disturbing.
What do you make of these reports that he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia? His medicine had been changed recently. And by the way, a lot of times schizophrenia can be drug-induced.
People with schizophrenia who are under treatment must not use hard illegal drugs.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head,
Do you agree that Nick Reiner is a dark horse and something of an enigma? Well, so is his younger sister Romy. The interesting thing with Romy is we get to know Nick through her, quite intimately actually, in ways and in areas that are quite surprising. For example, Romy seemed to be struggling with addiction herself, or some sort of substance issues, and even mental health as well. So how come she was able to overcome both of those, the addiction and also the mental health issues?
Their daughter Romy Reiner shares a look into a family vacation. On December 1st, Romy posts a recap of the family's tropical trip, including moments of her mom on the beach and her dad enjoying a swim with her.
It's quite hard to imagine Nick Reiner doing this sort of thing. It seems like the only thing he wanted to do was get high, doesn't it? And one does have to ask, where was he when these pictures were taken? Was he on this vacation? And if he wasn't, where was he? What was he doing?
Alongside the photos, the actress writes, thankful for family, health, and followers of any age.
Something else one has to consider, and one's heart really goes out to Romy. You can imagine if Romy had issues before this tragedy, basically during her pampered life, how much worse are those issues now, given that she and an unnamed additional person stumbled on the crime scene. And as crime scenes go, this wasn't just any murder scene. It was her own parents. It's something no one should ever have to see.
In a separate November 30th post, Romy shares another peek into her time with her parents, including a selfie of her dad wearing a Spinal Tap 2 baseball hat as the pair swims in the ocean.
And to have that memory seared into her subconscious, it really is a kind of death of innocence just before Christmas. In this analysis, I want to deal with a niggling regret Romy probably feels now. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Also, ho, 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 Mary Stillman 6534, thank you so much. I think that's perhaps the biggest super chat I think we've ever seen on this channel. Season's greetings to you wherever you are and everybody else celebrating at this time of the year. If you haven't yet hit the thanks button, please consider doing so, and let's get started. So an interesting article in the Daily Mail describes kind of cryptically a niggling regret Romy must be feeling. The article describes Romy as the youngest of the couple's 3 children who discovered her parents in a blood-soaked bed in their $13 million Brentwood mansion. And I'm not going to go into those same details, but I do agree that that image is going to play on repeat, I think, in her nightmares. And the thing is, she had nightmares before this. What emerges quite surprisingly when we turn our collective gaze to Romy are basically 2 things. Firstly, we see how Nick's tantrums and issues basically sucked up a lot of attention, a lot of resources in terms of the family dynamic. So much so that the coddling of Nick really did affect his siblings, Romy especially. According to the article, the other siblings resented him because who got the most attention? Nick. Who took all their energy? Nick. And who did they baby? Who did their parents baby the most? Nick. And if the family position was give him what he wants, do you think it was the same for Romy? Do you think it was the same for Jake? And how did that feel? One has to take this next bit with a pinch of salt. Was Romy also occasionally scared of her brother's temper tantrums? Was she also scared in terms of dealing with his outbursts? Remember, this guy went to rehab almost 20 times, and he was on some pretty kooky substances, and by his own admission, threw a rock through a glass presentation space just to score some meds. I mean, wasn't she right to be a little jumpy? And weren't Nick's parents too warm and fuzzy, and ultimately too complacent? According to the Daily Mail, she had been scared of her brother's temper and outbursts since their childhood, even before his addictions kicked in. Think about that. Even before his addictions, she was scared of him. Others say that she loved him dearly and never stopped worrying about him. And I agree with the writer of this article that both were probably true to varying degrees. And I mean, if you go through the material we already have, Rob Reiner, didn't he tell guests at the party hours before he was murdered that he was scared of Nick? I don't think he meant scared for Nick and worried about him in that sense. I think literally scared of Nick. And I don't think the way to deal with that is to take him to a party, because you may have noticed he basically scared other guests as well, and then he allegedly did something really scary. The local neighborhood gas station attendant who had experienced Nick casually a bunch of times kind of has a more blunt assessment of Nick. He was just a weirdo. Romy would come in always friendly and sweet to my employees, and she would try hard to always involve Nick in their conversations, but he would never really respond, just short answers or even a grunt. And that also just gives you an idea, if he was someone who didn't get a job and was kind of lazy, he also seemed to have that same entitled attitude, that same not willing to do any work, just in terms of casual human interactions as well. You kind of get a sense that he's quite narcissistic, and I don't use that word lightly. And so the point to notice here is how the attendant differentiates between the two siblings. One is a weirdo, sullen, unresponsive. The other appears to be sweet, balanced, engaging, and self-aware. But the interesting thing is that both siblings at a certain point in time were in a similar boat, suffering from addiction, suffering in terms of their mental health. So why was the one able to get out of that boat and the other one seemed to stay in it?
You can't make me do anything.
Choice. The problem is choice.
Indeed. I also like the way the Daily Mail basically summarized Nick using two words, directionless and destructive. And I think the one leads to the other.
As you adequately put, the problem is choice.
According to the article, Nick wouldn't be the first Hollywood-dwelling son of to go off the rails, but in truth, it seems he was just too cushioned. Look at those words, just too cushioned by the family coffers, but also just too cushioned in terms of how he was being brought up, how he was being parented, even as a adult and a sort of older child. Later in his life, the ultimate spoiled rich kid cliche taken to its most extreme. And that's where we sort of come up with that other cliche, poor little rich boy. And isn't that how he thought of himself? Directionless and destructive, he remained an overgrown teen despite the best efforts of everyone around him. It seems like everyone around him was trying to help him except himself. And does that work? Does that help? The article goes on to note, the indulgence even spilled into the professional sphere. Is it any surprise that while Romy's modest career remained independent from her family connections, and good for her in terms of that, Nick got the hands-on support from Dad during his own brief foray into the film business? And did that help? By the way, in a previous video when I said that Nick probably needed more authority in his life, this is before I even knew that his own kids had said that they felt they needed more boundaries. And that's what their own mother said about them. Well, someone felt I'd crossed the line by saying that. But I can understand how discipline and drug addiction are mutually exclusive. What drug addicts want is leeway, a loosey-goosey, warm and fuzzy, casual approach to everything, no responsibility, and unlimited reprieves and handouts. What they want is basically the path of least resistance. Well, any guesses where the path of least resistance takes you at the end of the day?
What happens if you blow it to your lap?
Nothing good.
And we see that character, Dr. Mann from Interstellar, he does take that path of least resistance and what happens. But think about it in a more practical way. Where does the path of least resistance take you? No discipline, no rules, no job, and you can do exactly what you want all the time. Well, at some point you are going to encounter rules, either someone else's or basically the rules of the system and the law.
What the hell is this?
It's necessary, Neo. For our protection.
From what?
From you.
And in a very real sense, law-abiding citizens do need to be protected from those who are following their own paths of least resistance, including criminals and drug addicts. I can think of a few other cases that involved coddled children who became murderers, mass murderers or serial killers. Scott Peterson, coddled. Brian Koberger, coddled. Lucy Letby, coddled. And arguably the Long Island serial killer as well. I don't know if I would use the same term to describe Alex Murdaugh because he was certainly entitled, but entitlement is an awfully close cousin to coddling. And here we have both high degrees not only of coddling, but entitlement as well. Do you see that?
Right now, there's only one rule. Our way or the highway.
Fine.
Please, Neo. You have to trust me.
Why?
Because you have been down there, Neo. You know that road.
And of course, Nick did know where that road led, to rehab. And of course, if you're going to insist on taking drugs, well, then rehab is going to feel like a waste of time. Most normal people know that the path of least resistance leads nowhere good. I mean, even Pinocchio knows this. You go to Pleasure Island, you start to live there, and eventually you become a jackass. You become good for nothing. No, it doesn't do any harm listening to your conscience. But I think that path to the dark side, it starts by being intentionally directionless. It starts by luxuriating, marinating in a kind of hedonism just because you can. And I think that's what being high all the time is, being directionless. And although that feels good, I think it makes you a very weak person and a person who's unable to sort of stand up in the real world. And also when a person like that encounters other people who are real people, functional people, they can't stand on their own either. And I think Nick realized this in a way at that party. And then the temptation is to blame someone. And who is really to blame here except himself? It's not his father's fame, and it's not his lack of fame, it's his lack of any agency. And if you never try, if you never make an effort, how are you going to gain agency? That's not how agency works. You don't get agency by somebody else giving it to you. That's something you've got to develop. That requires work. That requires effort. That requires discipline. That requires sacrifice. That requires inner strength and resources. And like a muscle, you only develop that by working on it. By the same token, you lose agency by not working on it, even if you're in a former place of fitness or strength or influence upon those around you or on this world. Even in this cartoon, you'll notice there are two individuals, the one that changes and doesn't notice it, and the other that does change and is appalled and then puts a stop to it. And what's the difference between the two? The one is self-awareness and self-discipline and a certain level of agency of himself, and the other doesn't. Most children learn self-discipline, but there are exceptions. The gamblers, the tricksters, and the jokers, all those, and the entitled, all those who think that they are the exceptions to all the rules, and nothing and no one is going to spoil their fun. So what was Romy's niggling regret? The Daily Mail seemed to suggest Nick's addiction could have and should have been handled differently. Differently? Well, in what way? Well, isn't the answer here discipline, boundaries, rules, tough love? If you think about it, was the double murder a singular event, in effect a singularity, or was it a logical conclusion, the inevitable destination, the inevitable result at the end of a well-worn, well-trodden path? According to the Daily Mail, police were repeatedly called to Rob Reiner's Brentwood mansion for years before his son allegedly murdered him and his wife. It sounds a lot like the O.J. Simpson case, with the cops repeatedly being summoned to O.J.'s home in Brentwood because Nicole Brown had been hurt. That happened again and again, just like in this case. The police were summoned again and again.
What did you think was going to happen?
When history repeats itself, what happens? It gains momentum. A season develops, and that burgeoning season must bring itself to a close, to its natural and logical denouement. According to the article, police had been responding to disturbances at Rob and Michelle's LA mansion for over a decade, long before the Hollywood legend and his wife were found dead. And if summoning the cops doesn't lead to stricter controls, guess what happens? The chaotic element runs free. And that chaotic element begins to take control. That chaotic element gains agency.
15 years old. He's buying illegal drugs. He was homeless for a while, breaking
He was
camping
homeless because he
laws.
ran away from rehab and refused to get the help his parents were paying for.
Yeah, and remember, Being Charlie, that movie that fictionalized his life, it's not a movie of recovery. There was no...
And so here's the number 4 clue we all missed. Romy Reiner is going to be the best, the most powerful, and probably the most influential witness in this case. She was at the crime scene. She knew the dynamics better than anyone. She was Nick's neighbor and best friend. She lived with him for years. If this case goes to trial, do you think she'll testify for the defense in sympathy for her brother or in aggravation for the prosecution? And whatever she does may well decide the outcome of this case. Whichever way she leans, the jury may well take their cue from her. Wouldn't you? Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas, if that's what you're doing. Otherwise, enjoy your holidays, and I'll see you guys next time.